Hi guys, in this lesson we're going to talk a little bit about quote sandwiches, which I think are some of the most important things that we're going to discuss this semester when it comes to bringing other people's words into your own paper. It's the main idea of Chapter 3 of They Say, I Say. Chapter 3 also has some other advice for you. We're going to focus mainly in this lesson on the quote sandwich. So let's get into why we need quote sandwiches. When we borrow other people's words, we have to give credit. We talked about how when you summarize and paraphrase, meaning you're borrowing somebody else's ideas but using your own words, you have to give credit by using signal phrases, parenthetical citations, stuff like that. If you're using not only somebody's ideas but someone else's specific words, that's when you have to quote to make sure you give an appropriate credit, in addition to using signal phrase, parenthetical citations, whatever else. So say we wrote this. Martin Luther King Jr. hoped for a land in which people would not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. You might think that that's okay because you're giving Martin Luther King credit, but it's actually not going to work because the stuff in blue is his words. If you just put it in there like that, what you're actually implying is that you came up with those words and you did not come up with, the words to perhaps one of the greatest speeches of all time. He did. You need to put it in quotes to make sure you give him appropriate credit. So you use quoting to give credit for borrowed words. This is where the quote sandwich comes in. And we'll talk about why we call it a quote sandwich in just a minute. When I see you guys quoting, and I say you guys, I know that some of you may be good at it, but freshmen in general, when they're quoting, they're pretty good at finding good quotes. You're reading through your research and you're like, oh, this is really great. I'm going to use this. You put the quote aside and you end up putting it somewhere in your paper. But the problem is a lot of people don't know how to use the quote correctly. When we actually use a quote in the paper, we want to make sure it's not just a good quote, but we know where it comes from and how it actually relates to the paper itself. Let's look at a bad example. And this is actually, from a few years ago. I know we have a different president now, but we're still going to go with the one about Obama. So what's wrong with this? Barack Obama was elected president of the United States on November 3rd, 2008. The election of Barack Obama represents a breakthrough in the struggle of the African American in society. Barack Obama took office on January 20th, 2009. Well, we can see that they've put something in quotes. They've found a good quote and they've put it in there. Should we be happy with this? Well, let's break it down a little bit. Barack Obama was elected president of the United States on November 3rd, 2008. We start off pretty strong. The election of Barack Obama represents a breakthrough in the struggle of the African American in society. So we've got the quote, but we don't know where it comes from. We don't know who said it. We don't know anything about it. Then Barack Obama took office on January 20th, 2009. And that's just like, hey, I'm done with this quote. I'm taking off. And that's why we call it a hit and run quote. It's like the author has come up, you've been driving along with him, he's been just fine, and then boom, he hits you with this quote out of nowhere, and he takes off without explaining what it means at all. People also call it a dropped quote because it's almost like the author has a basket full of quotes, and he's just walking around, just dropping them into the paper wherever he feels like it. Well, we don't want to do hit and run quotes like this one we just broke down, so this is where the quote sandwich comes in. Here's a sandwich, I guess it's a Chick-fil-A. Sandwiches have 3 layers, right? You've got bread, meat, and bread. So you probably figure the quote sandwich is going to have 3 layers as well. So let's talk about what they are. The first piece of bread, the first part of the quote sandwich, is the introduction to it. So we need to know 3 main things. We need to know who said this quote. We need to know what his credentials are, so why we should care that this guy had to say it. Remember, ethos, credibility is important. And third, we probably need to know where it was published. And I'll show you an example in just a minute. The meat is the quote itself. You make sure that you put it in quotation marks, and if you need a parenthetical citation, you provide that at the end. The last piece of bread, the final part of the quote sandwich, is the explanation. And this is the part that a lot of people leave out, but it's just as important as every other part. We need to know what that quote means, which means that sometimes if you have a difficult to understand quote, you may have to restate it in your own words. You may need to explain what somebody's saying. You may need to provide some sort of context so that we get the entire meaning of the quote and all its depth. Also, we need to understand what it's doing in your paper. Does it refute or support your argument? Does it provide another point of view on something? Why are you using this quote to begin with? Make sure you relate it back to your paper. with your upcoming They Say paper, you're probably going to be discussing how your particular quote serves as an example of ethos, pathos, or logos. So if we were to take this original version and make it better, it would look something like this. Barack Obama was elected President of the United States on November 3rd, 2008. James Smith, a popular political author, commented on the history-making event in his book, The Dawn of the Obama Era. So now we've got his name, what his credentials are, and where he made the quote. By the way, this book doesn't exist. I just made it up. Don't go try and read it. He claims, using the signal verb, one of those verbs from page 39 and 40 of They Say, I Say, the election of Barack Obama represents a breakthrough in the struggle of the African American in society. And there we've got our page number. Smith is right. So now we're agreeing with him. We understand why we brought this quote in, because he's providing an example that supports our claim. When Barack Obama took office on January 20th, 2009, he tore down a wall that had long stood between African Americans and political success. So, a quick note on the parenthetical citations. You noticed we used a parenthetical citation in there. Now, we're going to go into more detail on parenthetical citations next week, but make sure that you're following the correct rules of MLA format. So check Purdue OWL, which again we'll discuss more next week if you want to know the specifics. But if you say the author's name in the signal phrase, you don't have to include their name in the parenthetical citation. That's why I have just 14 here instead of Smith 14. If for some reason you didn't have a name here, you would need it in the parenthetical citation, but if you're doing a quote sandwich, you've got a signal phrase, so you know that we've already got the name and you can leave it out here. Make sure to remember that the period comes after the parenthetical citation. A lot of people like to put it inside of it. It actually goes after. Okay, now a couple more notes on quoting. We talked about summary and paraphrase when you wanted to bring in other people's ideas without bringing in their actual words. Well, why would we want to use their actual words? The last word of the day, the third one, is zombie. Why would we want to use their actual words? Well, there's a few examples. If the language is especially vivid or expressive. So, for example, that Martin Luther King speech, the I Have a Dream speech, one of the most beautiful speeches written of all time, we probably don't want to try and paraphrase it. We're not going to say it better than he did. Might as well keep his original words in there. When exact wording is needed for technical accuracy, so say you're talking about something complicated, you're writing a paper about nuclear physics or the way that light behaves in a black hole or something, we might want to get Stephen Hawking's words in there word for word to make sure that we get it accurate. When it is important to let the debaters of an issue explain their positions in their own words. Well, if you've got a controversial issue, you want to make sure that people know that this is what they say, not what I say. So I had a girl one time write her paper about marriage between different races, and she wanted to get in a voice of somebody who thought it was a bad idea for people of different races to get married. So she got a quote from the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. So horrible guy, right? She didn't want anybody thinking that it was her words, so she made sure to quote him so that it was his voice, not hers, saying these horrible things. And last, when the words of an important authority lend weight to an argument, if you want to add credibility, get an expert from the field and bring his actual words into it, and we'll be sure to have credibility. Now, how much should we quote? Well, that varies depending on what you're trying to accomplish, what your purpose is, who your audience is, but this is a pretty good approximate breakdown. I think that it works pretty well to have about 20% of your paper be direct quotes, and that's probably going to work out to like 2-3 quotes per page, something like that. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. If you ended up with 10%, that'd be fine. If you ended up with 25%, that'd be fine. But you can see if you ended up with only 5%, you'd hardly have anybody else's voice in there, and we want it to be they say, I say. But on the other hand, if you had 50%, it would feel like you were just cobbling together other people's words and trying to pass it off as your own. Another 30% can be paraphrase and summary. So it's your idea, or it's their ideas, but it's your voice. So it's still you in charge of the language, even though you're discussing the ideas of others. The remaining 50% is your ideas, your words, your voice. This is where you do introductions to quotes, you do introductions to the paper, you make connections, you argue against people. It's all the stuff that you're doing with this information that you bring in. So the paper is they say, I say, so it breaks down into 50% they say, 50% I say. but we still see 80% of the people or of the paper is your actual voice. So it's really your paper, even though you go back and forth between discussing ideas. So remember, quote often, but not too much, roughly 20%. And when you do it, always use a quote sandwich. You'll notice that it's longer when you use a quote sandwich. That'll get you to that 2-page, 3-page limit faster. So quote sandwiches, and you'll be gold.